At the heart of Friedrich Nietzsche's entire philosophical project lies a single explosive and terrifying proclamation. It is not an argument, but a diagnosis. It is not a hope, but a historical event. It is the three most famous and most profoundly misunderstood words in all of modern thought. God is dead. To understand Nietzsche, we must begin here, in the cold shadow of this cosmic event. He did not mean this as a gleeful cry of a triumphant atheist. This was not a celebration. It was the sober, chilling report of a cultural physician who had just checked the vital signs of Western civilization and found that its heart had stopped beating. The death he announced was not a literal event in some distant heaven, but a cultural and psychological event that had already taken place in the soul of modern Europe. The Christian God, Nietzsche argued, had for 2 millennia served as the absolute foundation for the entire Western world. He was not just a figure of religious worship, he was the metaphysical guarantor of all meaning, the divine source of all morality, and the ultimate foundation of all truth. He was the sun around which the entire planet of Western thought, culture, and life orbited. The very concepts of good and evil, the belief in the sanctity of the individual, the hope for cosmic justice, the faith in progress, all of it, whether acknowledged or not, rested on this single theological foundation. And this foundation, Nietzsche declared, had crumbled. The instrument of this death was not a single assassin, but the slow, corrosive work of Western civilization itself. We, he insists, are all the murderers. We killed God with the Enlightenment which taught us to trust in human reason over divine revelation. We killed him with the scientific revolution, which gave us a new story of the cosmos, a story of blind, material forces with no need for a creator. We killed him with historical criticism which revealed the Bible to be a human, all too human document. We killed him, finally, with our own hypocrisy. By continuing to pay lip service to a Christian morality while living lives dedicated to the purely worldly goals of comfort, commerce, and national power. We had, as a culture, rendered him unbelievable. Nietzsche dramatized this world historical event in a famous parable in his book The Gay Science. A madman lights a lantern in the bright morning hours and runs into the marketplace, crying out, "I seek God! I seek God!" The sophisticated atheists and intellectuals gathered there mock him. They do not take his quest seriously. For them, God's absence is a simple, unproblematic fact. But the madman, who is a prophet speaking to a world that cannot yet understand him, turns on them with a terrible fury. "Where is God?" he cries. "I will tell you. We have killed him. You and I. We are all his murderers." He then forces them to confront the sheer cosmic scale of what has happened. What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions. Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? This is the central image. The death of God is not an act of liberation that leads to a sunny new age of reason. It is an act of cosmic de-anchoring. It is the moment we discover that our planet is no longer held in a stable, meaningful orbit, but is now hurtling, untethered, into an infinite, cold and empty darkness. The problem, as the madman realizes, is that the murderers do not yet feel the cold. The news of the event is still on its way. The deed is still more distant to them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. The immediate and most devastating consequence of this event, Nietzsche prophesied, would be the coming of a new and terrible guest to Europe. Nihilism. With the foundation of all values gone, the entire structure of Western meaning was doomed to collapse. If there is no divine law, then our morality is just a human habit. If there is no divine purpose, then our existence is just a cosmic accident. If there is no true world beyond this one, then all our suffering is without redemption. This is the abyss that opens up when God died. Nietzsche saw that this was not just a problem for religious believers. The death of God was a catastrophe for atheists as well, because their entire moral system, their belief in compassion, in human rights, in the intrinsic value of the individual, was, he argued, a secularized inheritance from Christianity. It was a Christian morality without the Christian God to support it. It was a cut flower, beautiful for a time, but severed from its roots and destined to wither. The proclamation, God is dead is therefore not an endpoint. It is the great and terrifying starting point for Nietzsche's entire philosophy. It is the fundamental problem of the modern age. His work is a desperate attempt to answer the question the madman leaves hanging in the air. Now that we have killed God, how can we possibly avoid becoming gods ourselves, simply to appear worthy of it? How can humanity create a new meaning, a new set of values, in a world that has been stripped of all its old foundations, without collapsing into the spiritual black hole of nihilism? Of course, I understand the new instructions. I will now write a single, detailed response, covering the next 3 points from your list, with each point developed to at least 800. I will also adhere to the specific stylistic rule of using periods only at the end of each paragraph. Let us proceed. Christianity is a slave morality that glorifies weakness and condemns strength. The death of the Christian God was, for Nietzsche, not the cause of the sickness of the modern soul, but its ultimate symptom, the final confirmation of a spiritual poisoning that had begun 2,000 years earlier with a secret, brilliant, and world-conquering act of spiritual revenge. To understand the values that died with God, we must perform a genealogy, an archaeology of the soul, to uncover the origins of the faith that had defined the West. A faith that Nietzsche diagnosed not as a divine revelation, but as the most sophisticated and successful slave morality in human history. This was not a morality born from strength, from health, from a triumphant affirmation of life, but from its opposite, from the cellar of the human soul, from the suffering, the powerlessness, the trampled upon, and the secretly vengeful who, being too weak to conquer their masters in the real world, conspired to conquer them in the world of the spirit. The entire project begins with the psychological condition of the oppressed, with the impotent, brooding hatred that Nietzsche called by its French name, ressentiment, for it is a feeling that is not a clean, honest anger that leads to action, but a repressed, festering poison that turns inward, contaminating the very soul of the man who feels it. The man of ressentiment is the slave, the priest, the weakling, who looks upon the noble, powerful master, the Roman warrior, the Greek hero, and feels a profound and gnawing envy, a hatred for the master's effortless strength, his good health, his pride, his happiness, his very existence. Being unable to act on this hatred, to take his revenge in the world of deeds, he is forced to take it in the world of the imagination, and it is here, in this dark factory of the soul, that the slave morality performs its first and most creative act, the invention of evil. The noble master, in his own morality, never saw his enemies as evil, for he saw them merely as bad, as contemptible, as unfortunate, but not as morally damnable. Yet the man of ressentiment, in a stroke of sublime spiritual vengeance, looks at the master and declares that his very nature, his strength, his pride, his health, are not just unfortunate, but are morally and metaphysically evil. The noble warrior is no longer just an oppressor, he is the evil one, the sinner, a creature who deserves to be punished, not just in this life, but in the eternal fires of a hell that has been specifically invented for him. This is the birth of a new and profoundly unhealthy kind of gaze, a moralizing squint that sees to find fault, to condemn, and to poison the very wellsprings of life itself. Once this concept of the evil enemy has been created, the second act of the slave revolt follows with a flawless and terrible logic. For if the strong, the proud, and the happy are evil, then who are the good? And the answer, of course, is that the good are we, the suffering, the poor, the meek, the humble, the very ones who are being crushed by the masters. The slave morality performs a complete transvaluation of all values, an inversion of the aristocratic equation of value. The slave's own weakness, his inability to strike back, is now reframed as the beautiful virtue of patience. His necessary and fearful humility is rebranded as the sacred virtue of humility. His inability to harm anyone becomes the moral excellence of goodness and forgiveness. And pity, the feeling for the suffering and the downtrodden, the one emotion that the noble master most despised as a contagious and weakening sickness, is now elevated to the status of the virtue of all virtues, the very hallmark of a good soul. Christianity, for Nietzsche, is the ultimate and most successful institutionalization of this slave revolt in morality. A religion that has taken the values born from the weakness and resentment of the oppressed and has, through a 2,000-year-long spiritual war, managed to convince even the masters themselves that these are the only true and eternal values. It is a religion that glorifies the very qualities that are symptoms of a declining life, a religion that has taught humanity to be ashamed of its strength, to feel guilty for its pride, and to see its own healthiest instincts as sins, thereby creating a world of tame, sick, and mediocre animals who have forgotten what it means to be truly great. Priests invented sin and guilt to control people. At the very heart of this great slave revolt in morality, Nietzsche identifies a particular type of human being who acted as its genius, its strategist, and its first and greatest psychologist, the ascetic priest. The priest, in Nietzsche's analysis, is a profoundly complex and fascinating figure. For he is not a simple charlatan, but a man who is himself a sufferer, a man who is sick but who has a tremendous and powerful will to master both his own sickness and the sickness of those around him. He is the shepherd of a sick flock, a doctor of the soul, and his power is built upon a single brilliant and devastating invention, the most effective tool for psychological control ever devised, the concepts of sin and guilt. The priest comes to the suffering masses, to the herd of the weak and the oppressed who are consumed by their own resentment, their own free-floating anger and misery, and he offers them a diagnosis and a cure. The great problem for the sufferer is that they do not understand the cause of their pain, and they direct their vengeful instincts outward towards their masters, a path that would lead only to their own destruction. The priest performs a great and terrible act of redirection, for he tells the sufferer, "You are looking for someone to blame. You are right to do so, but you are looking in the wrong direction. The cause of your suffering," he whispers, "is not your enemy, it is not your oppressor. It is you are suffering because you are a sinner, because you are guilty." This is a stroke of psychological genius. It takes the formless, destructive energy of resentment and it turns it inward, against the self. This is the birth of the bad conscience, the great inner sickness of modern man. The human animal's natural, healthy instincts for aggression, for sexuality, for pride, are now reinterpreted as sins, as transgressions against a divine and unbreachable law. The individual is now at war with himself, his natural instincts condemned by his own moral consciousness, creating a state of permanent inner turmoil, a secret self-torture that makes him feel perpetually unworthy and in need of redemption. And who is the only one who can offer this redemption, who can provide a temporary relief from this self-inflicted agony? The answer, of course, is the priest himself. He is the one who has diagnosed the disease, and he is the only one who possesses the cure, the medicine of forgiveness. The priest does not actually heal the underlying sickness, for a truly healthy and guilt-free human being would have no need for him. Instead, he becomes the master of the sick, a doctor who brilliantly manages the symptoms of a disease he himself has created, thereby making the herd completely and permanently dependent upon his spiritual authority. This is his subtle and profound will to power. He creates a system, a church, that provides a framework for organizing this guilt, for giving meaning to this suffering. He invents rituals of confession and penance, acts through which the sinner can temporarily relieve their inner tension. He offers the promise of a future world, a heaven, where this suffering will be compensated, thereby making the present-day suffering not just bearable but meaningful. He takes the natural pain of existence, and he sanctifies it, turning it from a meaningless affliction into a sign of moral and spiritual distinction. The very act of suffering now becomes proof of one's virtue, a holy martyrdom that guarantees a reward in the next life, a logic that is a profound and total slander against this one. The priest, in effect, hypnotizes the herd into a state of willing submission, using the concepts of sin and guilt to suppress their vitality, to tame their wild instincts, and to transform them from dangerous predators into a predictable, manageable, and sick flock. There is no objective good or evil. Morality is a human invention. The final and most devastating consequence of this entire genealogical investigation, this ruthless unmasking of the all-too-human origins of our most sacred values, is the discovery that lies at the bottom of the abyss. Having demonstrated that the dominant morality of the West was a human invention created by a specific group to serve its own interests, Nietzsche is forced to a more universal and more terrifying conclusion, that there is no objective good or evil at all. The entire concept of a universal, cosmic, and eternally valid moral law is a fiction. This is the necessary and inescapable conclusion of the death of God. If there is no divine lawgiver, then there can be no divine law. If the universe is not a rational creation with an inherent purpose, then it has no inherent moral structure. The world, in itself, is completely silent on the question of how we ought to live. It is a world beyond good and evil. All of our moral systems, without exception, are purely human inventions. They are not truths that we discover, they are values that we create. This is the great, liberating, and terrifying burden that Nietzsche places upon us. He shows us that we are not living in a pre-scripted moral drama with a divine author. We are living in a world without a script, without a director, and without a final judgment. We are the actors, the writers, and the audience of our own moral play. The values that we hold most dear, our belief in compassion, in justice, and human rights, have no more cosmic authority than the values of an ancient Roman noble or a Viking warrior. They are simply the values that our particular herd, at this particular moment in history, has found it useful to believe in. This leads him to his great doctrine of Perspectivism. As we have seen, he argues that there are no facts, only interpretations. This applies most profoundly to the world of morality. There is no single, true moral perspective. Every moral judgment is a judgment made from a particular perspective, and every perspective is an expression of a particular set of instincts, a particular set of needs, a particular form of the will to power. The question to ask of any moral system is not, is it true? For that is a meaningless question. The only meaningful question is, what kind of life does this moral system serve? Does it promote a healthy, strong, ascending, and life-affirming type of human being? Or does it promote a sick, weak, decadent, and life-denying one? This is the new and terrible responsibility that Nietzsche gives to the philosopher of the future. The task is no longer to be a humble servant of a pre-existing moral truth. The task is to become a creator of new values. It is to be a physician of culture, a man who can distinguish between healthy and unhealthy moralities, and who has the courage to legislate new values that will lead to the enhancement and not the diminishment of human life. He is not a moral relativist in the lazy sense that anything goes. He is an aristocrat of the spirit who believes that some values are demonstrably higher, nobler, and healthier than others. Not because they are true, but because they are the expression of a stronger and more life-affirming will. 5. Master morality versus slave morality. The strong create values, the weak resent them. This great historical battle, this 2,000-year-long war for the soul of humanity, was fought between two fundamentally opposed and irreconcilable armies of values. To understand the world we have inherited, we must first understand the nature of these two great antagonists. Nietzsche, acting as a moral archaeologist, unearthed these two primordial systems. The first, the original, and for him the healthier of the two, he called master morality. This is the morality of the noble soul, the ancient, aristocratic, and life-affirming ruling classes of the pre-Christian world. It is the worldview of the Homeric Greek hero, whose life is a glorious performance on the stage of honor. It is the morality of the Roman patrician, who feels the weight of his ancestors and the destiny of his city in his very bones. It is a morality that is born from a position of immense and unshakable strength, from a profound and overflowing feeling of power. The absolute foundational principle of master morality is that value is created from within. The noble individual does not look outside of himself for a standard of what is good. He is not concerned with the approval of the community, the judgment of a god, or the utility of his actions for others. Value flows directly and spontaneously from his own being. His own powerful instincts, his own aesthetic judgment, his own feeling of what is noble and what is base, this is the source of all value. He looks at himself, at his own strength, his courage, his pride, his health, and in a great act of self-affirmation, he declares, "This is good." His morality is a great and resounding yes to himself and to life. He is the creator, the legislator, the artist of values. The things he does are not good because they conform to a pre-existing rulebook. They become good precisely because he, the noble soul, is the one who does them. His every action is an act of bestowing value upon the world. The psychological foundation for this way of being is a feeling that Nietzsche called the pathos of distance. This is not a reasoned argument for one's own superiority, it is a deep, instinctual, and unwavering feeling of the vast chasm that separates the noble from the common, the strong from the weak, the master from the slave. This feeling is not born of hatred, but of a kind of profound and effortless self-confidence. It allows the noble to look down upon the weak and the powerless, not with malice, but with a kind of benevolent contempt. A looking down upon that is as natural as a mountain looking down upon a valley. From this self-affirming foundation, a specific set of virtues naturally arises. Pride is paramount, a deep and abiding reverence for oneself and one's own judgment. Courage is essential, not just physical bravery, but a spiritual embrace of challenge, of hardship, and of a dangerous life. Honor is the currency of this world, a strict code of conduct that governs one's duties, but only to one's peers, to one's equals. There is a profound respect for a worthy enemy, an admiration for another strong soul that can provide a glorious test of one's own power. And there is generosity, a kindness that flows not from a sentimental pity for the weak, but from an overflow of one's own immense power, a gift bestowed from a position of strength. And what of the opposite of this good? In this system, the opposite is simply bad. It is not a moral condemnation, it is a statement of contempt. The common man, the slave, the weakling, he is bad in the same way a dull sword is bad. He is poorly made, ineffective, and ultimately insignificant. This entire worldview was, in Nietzsche's estimation, a healthier and more honest form of morality, because it was a direct expression of the life-affirming will to power. But it was not the morality that won the great historical war. It was conquered and almost completely erased by its great and terrible opposite, slave morality. Slave morality is born in a completely different world, from a completely different psychological state. It is the morality of the oppressed, the suffering, the powerless, the herd. It does not begin with a joyful yes to itself. It begins with a hateful, resentful no to the outside world. The slave's first creative act is to look outward, at the noble master, who is the cause of his suffering. And in an act of sublime spiritual revenge, he invents a new concept in the human universe. He declares that the master, with all his strength and his pride, is evil. Once this evil enemy has been created, the slave morality then defines good as its opposite. Good in this new system is everything the master is not. Good is everything that the slave is. The slave's own weakness, their inability to take revenge, is now reframed as the beautiful virtue of patience and forgiveness. Their necessary humility is rebranded as the sacred virtue of humility. Their inability to harm anyone becomes the moral excellence of goodness. And pity, the feeling for the suffering which the master morality despised as a sickness, now becomes the virtue of all virtues. This is the great slave revolt in morality. It is a complete and total inversion of the aristocratic equation of value, born from the most poisonous and life-denying of all human emotions, ressentiment. And it is this morality, Nietzsche declares, with a mixture of horror and admiration for its sheer genius, that has triumphed. We, in the modern world, with our democratic, egalitarian, and Christian-derived values, are the inheritors of this 2,000-year-old victory of the weak over the strong. 6. Pity is poison. It multiplies suffering instead of reducing it. At the very heart of this triumphant slave morality, Nietzsche identifies its central and most cherished virtue, the one emotion that it has elevated above all others. It is the virtue of pity. In the modern world, to be a good person is, above all, to be a compassionate and pitying person. We are taught that to feel pity for the suffering, for the weak, for the unfortunate, is the highest expression of our humanity. Our entire social and political world is increasingly built upon this foundation. Nietzsche looked at this most sacred of all our modern values, and he declared it to be a profound and dangerous poison. His critique of pity is not a call for simple cruelty or a lack of compassion. It is a deep and subtle psychological diagnosis. He is asking, what does the act of pity actually do? Does it truly help the sufferer? And what effect does it have on the one who pities? First, Nietzsche argues that pity multiplies suffering. When you feel pity for someone, you are not alleviating their suffering. You are taking their suffering upon yourself. you are allowing their sickness to infect you. One person was suffering. Now 2 people are suffering. The total amount of suffering in the world has increased, not decreased. For Nietzsche, a healthy, strong spirit is one that can look upon suffering without being dragged down by it. The noble soul may help the unfortunate, but he does so from a position of strength and an overflow of power, not from a shared sense of misery. Pity, in contrast, is a contagious disease. It is the emotional equivalent of a pandemic, a force that drains the energy and the vitality of the healthy by forcing them to focus on the sick and the decaying. Second, Nietzsche argues that pity is profoundly condescending and life-denying for the one who is pitied. To pity someone is to see them only in their suffering. It is to affirm their weakness. It is to say to them, "You are a poor, helpless victim, and I, the strong and healthy one, feel sorry for you." This does not inspire the sufferer to overcome their condition. It keeps them trapped in their role as a victim. It wallows in their weakness. A true, noble form of help, Nietzsche would argue, would be to treat the sufferer as a potential equal, as someone who possesses the strength to overcome their own hardship. It would be to challenge them, to inspire them, to give them a goal that would pull them out of their own misery. Pity, in contrast, is a soft, gentle, and deeply insulting emotion that keeps the weak weak. It is the spiritual equivalent of giving a starving man a sedative instead of teaching him how to fish. Third, and most importantly, the religion of pity is, for Nietzsche, the ultimate expression of the ascetic ideal. It is a sophisticated and subtle manifestation of the will to nothingness. Why do we praise pity? Because it is an act of self-denial. To feel pity is to deny our own joy, our own health, our own strength, in favor of focusing on the suffering of others. It is a way of making ourselves feel good by devaluing our own life-affirming instincts. It is, at its root, a symptom of a decadent culture, a culture that is weary of life and has begun to find a morbid and perverse pleasure in the spectacle of suffering itself. We are no longer strong enough to celebrate the triumphant, healthy, and happy individual. We are only comfortable celebrating the victim, the failure, the sick. This is why he saw the great artists and writers of his day, like Dostoevsky, as both brilliant psychologists and dangerous seducers. They had made the suffering, the humiliated, and the downtrodden interesting. They had made sickness itself into something beautiful and profound. This, for Nietzsche, was a dangerous sign. He understood the appeal of pity. He felt it in himself. The biographical agony of Nietzsche was his own constant battle against his own profound capacity for compassion. He was a man who, in his final moment of sanity, broke down and threw his arms around a beaten horse. He was not a monster. He was a man who understood the seductive power of pity so well that he knew he had to wage a philosophical war against it, both in the world and in his own soul. He knew that if the highest value of a society is the elimination of suffering, then that society will inevitably declare war on all forms of greatness, because greatness is always born from struggle and from the overcoming of immense pain. A society that worships pity will in the end create a world of comfortable, safe, and spiritually empty last men. 7. There are no facts, only interpretations. Truth is perspectival. Having dismantled the foundations of Western morality and religion, Nietzsche then turns his hammer to the final and most sacred idol of all, the belief in truth itself. For 2,000 years, from Plato to the scientists of his own day, the entire project of Western thought had been a relentless quest for the truth. A single, objective, eternal, and universal reality that exists independently of our own minds. Nietzsche, in his most radical and most influential philosophical move, declares that this entire quest is a delusion. He famously declared, in a note from his late period, "There are no facts, only interpretations." This is the core of his great doctrine of Perspectivism. He is arguing that the very idea of a God's eye view of reality, a view from nowhere, is a logical and psychological impossibility. Every view is a view from somewhere. Every act of knowing is an act of seeing the world from a particular perspective, and every perspective is shaped by our unique history, our culture, our language, our instincts, and our deepest unconscious needs. To explain this, imagine a complex and beautiful sculpture. You can walk around this sculpture and observe it from an infinite number of different angles. From this angle, you see a certain set of lines and shadows. From that angle, you see a completely different set. From up close, you see the texture of the stone. From far away, you see its overall form. Which of these is the true view of the sculpture? The question is absurd. Each perspective is a true and valid representation of the sculpture from that particular point of view. But none of them on its own captures the entire, complex reality of the object. To claim that your one single perspective is the truth would be an act of arrogant foolishness. Reality itself, Nietzsche argues, is like this sculpture. And every living being, every culture, every philosophy is looking at it from a different perspective. And what drives these interpretations? The will to power. Every perspective is an expression of a particular will to power. It is an interpretation of the world that serves the life, the growth, and the power of the being that holds it. There is no such thing as a disinterested search for truth. To even look at the world is to already be interpreting it, to be selecting certain things as important and ignoring others, all in the service of your own deepest needs. The scientist's perspective is a will to power that seeks to master the world through prediction and control. The priest's perspective is a will to power that seeks to master the world by giving it a moral meaning. This leads Nietzsche to ask a deeply unsettling genealogical question. What is the value of our famous will to truth? We assume that the desire for truth is always a noble and virtuous thing. But Nietzsche, the psychologist, is suspicious. He argues that this fanatical desire for a single objective and unchanging truth is often a symptom of weakness. It is a disguised form of the ascetic ideal. It is the desire of a spirit that cannot handle the chaotic, dynamic, and ever-changing reality of life itself. And so it creates for itself a comforting, fictional, true world, Plato's world of forms, the Christian heaven, the eternal laws of science, that is more stable, more predictable, and more orderly than the real world of becoming. The will to truth is often a secret will to escape from life. The biographical agony for Nietzsche was that he was a man who was trained at the highest level to be a servant of this will to truth. As a classical philologist, his entire profession was based on the meticulous, objective interpretation of text to discover their one true meaning. His entire philosophical journey, therefore, was a profound and difficult rebellion against the very foundation of his own training. He had to overcome his own deeply ingrained instinct as a scholar to arrive at this more profound and more honest understanding of the nature of knowledge. This does not mean, however, that he was a lazy relativist who believed that all interpretations are equal. This is a common and profound misunderstanding. While no perspective can be true in the absolute sense, some perspectives are far better than others. And what is the standard of judgment? The will to power. Some interpretations are healthier, stronger, more comprehensive, and more life-affirming than others. A perspective that leads to strength, creativity, and a love of life is superior to one that leads to weakness, decadence, and resentment. The goal for the noble spirit is not to be without a perspective. That is impossible. The goal is to have many perspectives. He called this having many eyes. The stronger, more flexible, and more intellectually powerful a spirit is, the more perspectives it can entertain, the more different eyes it can look through to see the world. This, for Nietzsche, is the real meaning of objectivity. 8. Philosophy is mostly masked autobiography. Thinkers rationalize their instincts. This radical perspectival understanding of truth leads directly to one of Nietzsche's most devastating and insightful psychological critiques. If all truth is merely an interpretation driven by an unconscious will to power, then what of the great, seemingly objective and rational systems of the philosophers themselves? His answer is, as ruthless as it is brilliant. Philosophy is mostly a masked autobiography. He argues that the great philosophers throughout history were not the detached, disinterested, and purely logical seekers of truth that they pretended to be. They were, in fact, advocates. They were cunning lawyers, arguing for their own deepest and most personal prejudices, for their own physiological needs, for the secret and often unconscious demands of their own instincts. Every great philosophy, he declares, is a personal confession and an involuntary and unconscious memoir. The philosopher does not discover his system through cold, logical deduction. He already has the conclusion, a conclusion that has been dictated to him by his own innermost nature, and his entire vast and complex intellectual system is just a sophisticated and elaborate rationalization. a fortress of reasons built to defend a pre-existing and deeply personal conviction. To understand a philosopher, Nietzsche advises, you must not just look at his arguments, you must look at the man himself. You must ask, what kind of life does this morality, this metaphysics, this system of thought actually serve? What is the will to power that is being expressed through this philosophical mask? Let us look at his examples. Plato, the great champion of the true world of the forms, the eternal, unchanging and perfect ideas that lie behind this messy, sensory world of appearances. What was he? He was an aristocrat, a man from an old and noble family who was watching his beloved Athens decline into the chaos of democratic mob rule. His philosophy, with its hatred of the body, its suspicion of the senses, its yearning for a calm, eternal, and perfectly ordered world beyond this one, was not a discovery about the cosmos. It was the expression of a tired, decadent, and aristocratic soul that could no longer affirm the chaotic reality of life itself. Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher of the category imperative, the man who tried to ground morality in a universal and absolute law of reason. What was he? He was the product of a deeply pious and rigidly disciplined German upbringing. He was a man of such predictable habits that his neighbors in Königsberg were said to have set their watches by his daily walk. His entire complex and seemingly impersonal ethical system, Nietzsche argues, is just a philosophical universalization of the quiet, dutiful, and unquestioning obedience that was in his own blood. It is the voice of a Prussian drill sergeant disguised as the voice of pure reason. Even Spinoza, with his beautiful and cold geometrical ethics, what was he? He was a man who had been excommunicated, a solitary and perhaps fearful soul. His philosophy, which sees the universe as a perfect, deterministic, and logical system, was a way of transforming the chaotic and passionate world into something he could master and feel safe in. It was a defensive maneuver of a shy and reclusive scholar. The biographical agony that gave Nietzsche the clarity for this insight was, once again, his own ruthless self-analysis. He was a philosopher, and he knew that he was not immune to this same critique. He was brutally honest about his own motivations. He admits that his own philosophy, his celebration of strength, of health, of the will to power, is a direct reflection of his own personal and physiological reality. It is the philosophy of a man who was almost constantly sick, and who therefore came to value health above all else. It is the philosophy of a man who was weak, and who therefore created an ideal of absolute strength. His work is the ultimate example of his own thesis. It is the most magnificent and most honest of all autobiographies. This insight has profound implications. It means that we can never again read philosophy with a naive trust in its own claims to objectivity. We must always read with a third ear, listening not just for the arguments, but for the instincts, the desires, the fears, and the will to power that lie hidden beneath them. It means that every philosophical system is a symptom of a certain kind of life. And it means that the ultimate question we must ask of any philosophy is not, is it true? We must ask the more vital, the more honest, and the more deeply personal question: does it serve life? Does it enhance life? Does it make the human being who believes in it stronger, healthier, and more powerful? This is the final, unmasking act of Nietzsche's genealogical hammer. He reveals that the great, noble, and supposedly disinterested search for truth that has defined philosophy for 2,000 years is in the end, just another human, all too human form of the will to power. 12. What does not kill me makes me stronger. Suffering is the engine of growth. In the entire landscape of modern thought, perhaps no single phrase is more famous, more quoted, and more profoundly misunderstood than this one. For it has been adopted by athletes and entrepreneurs as a motivational slogan, printed on posters and turned into a comforting platitude of optimistic resilience, a simple reassurance that everything will be okay in the end. But for Friedrich Nietzsche, the man who first wrote it in the pages of his Twilight of the Idols, this was not a comforting thought at all. It was a brutal, terrifying, and deeply serious diagnosis of the fundamental law of all life, the central pillar of his war against the comfortable, pain-averse morality of his entire civilization. To truly understand this famous aphorism, we must first understand the great enemy it was designed to destroy. For Nietzsche looked at the dominant value systems of his age. Christianity, with its emphasis on pity and a heavenly reward for earthly suffering, and the rising tide of English utilitarianism, with its bland, shopkeeper's goal of achieving the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and he was filled with a profound and nauseating contempt. He saw both as different expressions of the same decadent, life-denying impulse, the belief that the goal of human existence is to achieve a state of happiness and to eliminate all suffering, a philosophy he considered fit only for a weak, tired, and decadent species. The very value system that was actively breeding the last man, a creature who desires nothing more than a pitiable comfort and who sees all forms of pain and hardship as a failure, a mistake, a technical problem to be solved and medicated away. Nietzsche's entire philosophy is a declaration of war on this idea, for he argues that a life without suffering would not be a better life at all. It would be a shallower, weaker, and less meaningful one, a life devoid of the very challenges that create depth, that forge character, and that make greatness possible. He believed that the very qualities we admire most in human beings, courage, creativity, wisdom, resilience, a profound depth of soul, are not born in the sunny, well-tended gardens of happiness. They are forged, without exception, in the fire of adversity, in the crucible of pain. This is what he called the discipline of great suffering, and he argued that this and this alone is the force that has created every elevation of the human type so far, the great and necessary engine of all human growth. This process works on multiple levels, for first, on a psychological level, suffering is the great and merciless destroyer of our most cherished illusions. A life of comfort and ease allows us to maintain a naive and childishly optimistic view of ourselves and the world, but it is only when we are broken by genuine hardship, by illness, by heartbreak, by failure, by loss, that our comfortable certainties are shattered into 1,000 pieces. Suffering forces us to confront the brutal, tragic, and often absurd reality of existence, stripping away our social masks, our self-deceptions, and our easy answers, and it is only from this place of profound and often agonizing disillusionment that a deeper, more honest, and more resilient understanding of life can finally begin to grow. Second, suffering is the primary tool of self-overcoming, for it is the necessary resistance against which our will to power must struggle, and in that struggle become stronger. Nietzsche uses the powerful metaphor of a mountain climber, for the greatest feeling of joy, the most breathtaking view, and the most profound sense of accomplishment comes only after the most difficult, most dangerous, and most painful ascent. A truth that shows the struggle is not an unfortunate obstacle on the way to the goal, but rather that the struggle is the goal, the very thing that gives the final achievement its meaning and its value. To wish away the suffering is to wish away the greatness. For a person who has never had to overcome great resistance is a person who has never truly tested their own strength. They are a bow that has never been drawn taut, a weapon that has never been tested in the heat of battle. This leads to the most important aspect of this idea, which is that suffering is the necessary condition for a profound affirmation of life. It is easy to say yes to life when things are going well, when you are happy and healthy, but this, for Nietzsche, is a shallow and fragile affirmation, the yes of a fair-weather friend. The ultimate test of a noble soul, the test that separates the Ubermensch from the last man, is whether you can still say yes to life in the face of its terror, its pain, and its meaninglessness. The person who has suffered deeply, who has looked into the abyss of existence and has not been destroyed by it, and who can still, in spite of everything, find the strength to love their fate. This is the highest and noblest type of human being. The spirit that has achieved the state of amor fati. The biographical agony that underpins this entire philosophy is, of course, Nietzsche's own life. For this aphorism was not an abstract theory for him. It was his only possible survival strategy. He was a man who lived in a state of almost constant and often debilitating physical pain, plagued by blinding migraines, by violent fits of vomiting, by a failing body that was a constant source of agony and humiliation. A man who also suffered from a profound and almost total intellectual and social loneliness. By any objective measure, his life was a catalogue of suffering. A life that would have given anyone else every reason to curse their fate and to embrace a philosophy of pessimism and despair. And yet it was from the very heart of this suffering that he forged his great, life-affirming philosophy, For he had to find a way to reframe his own agonizing existence, to turn his own weakness and sickness into a source of philosophical strength and insight. He came to see his own illness, not as a curse, but as a gift, as a whetstone for his spirit, as the very thing that gave him the unique perspective of the outsider, allowing him to look at the healthy and normal values of his time and to see their hidden sickness, their decadence. His constant pain forced him to develop an almost superhuman will, a spiritual strength that could endure where a healthy body would have simply given up, and he did not just survive his suffering, he weaponized it, transforming the lead of his own personal agony into the gold of his philosophy. We must be clear, however, that Nietzsche is not a masochist, for he is not praising suffering for its own sake, nor is he saying that we should actively seek out pain. The goal is not to suffer, the goal is to overcome suffering. The value is not in the wound itself, but in the strength that is developed in the process of healing it, the new power that is born from the struggle. It is the use to which suffering is put that determines whether it is a destructive poison or a creative medicine. This is the terrible and heroic heart of Nietzsche's vision for a higher humanity. For he teaches that we should not pray for a life without burdens, but for a stronger back to carry them. The soul is not a delicate flower to be protected from the storm. It is a weapon to be forged in the fire of adversity. The deepest and most joyful affirmation of life is found not in the absence of pain, but in the profound and terrible knowledge that you have faced the very worst that existence can throw at you, and it has not destroyed you. It has, in the end, only made you who you are. 13. Life has no inherent meaning. Humans must create their own values. This difficult and heroic embrace of suffering, this transformation of pain into spiritual strength, is not an end in itself, it is a preparation, a strengthening of the soul for its greatest and most terrifying task. For after the death of God has revealed that the universe is silent, after the genealogy of morals has revealed that our values are a fiction, we are left standing naked in a world stripped of all its old comforts, facing the most fundamental of all modern questions. If there is no divine purpose, no cosmic plan, and no inherent truth, then what is the meaning of our existence? The answer that Nietzsche gives to this question is the great, deafening silence at the heart of his philosophy. For his first and most courageous act of intellectual honesty is to admit that there is no answer to be found, because life has no inherent meaning, a truth that shatters 2,000 years of Western thought, revealing the cosmos not as a rational and purposeful creation, but as a chaotic, immoral, and completely indifferent interplay of the will to power. A great, blind, and meaningless cosmic storm. This is the final, terrifying conclusion of the death of God. The full realization of the abyss of nihilism. The recognition that our deep human longing for meaning, for purpose, for a justification for our suffering, is met by the cold, empty, and eternal silence of the stars. For millennia, Western civilization had been built on the opposite assumption, for it had believed that meaning was something to be discovered, a truth that was already woven into the fabric of reality. For the Platonist, meaning was found in the contemplation of the eternal forms. For the Christian, meaning was found in the fulfillment of God's divine plan. Even for the scientists of Nietzsche's day, there was a kind of meaning to be found in the discovery of the rational and orderly laws of nature, a faith that there was a secret code to the universe that we could with our reason eventually decipher. But Nietzsche, with his hammer, shatters all of these comforting illusions. For he argues that these were never discoveries. They were inventions, beautiful and often useful fictions that we created to shield ourselves from the terrifying and unbearable truth of a meaningless existence. Comforting stories we told ourselves to avoid the vertigo of a world without an up or a down. This is the great crisis and the great turning point of his philosophy for the weak spirit, the spirit of the last man, when confronted with this abyss of meaninglessness, collapses into a passive, weary despair, seeking only to numb the pain with trivial comforts and mindless distractions. But the strong spirit, the noble soul, the spirit that has been strengthened by the discipline of great suffering, sees this abyss not as a prison, but as a space of supreme and terrifying opportunity. If there is no pre-existing meaning, if there is no divine script for the human drama, then a new and magnificent possibility opens up, the possibility that humans must create their own values. For we are no longer just the discoverers of meaning, we are its sole and absolute creators. The meaning of life is not something we find, It is something we must build, and we must become the poets of our own lives, the artists of our own existence. The central model for this new human being is the artist, for an artist does not discover a pre-existing beauty in a formless block of marble. She imposes her own will, her own vision of beauty, onto the chaotic material, and in doing so creates a new value in the world, a new standard of what is beautiful. The value creator, the Ubermensch, must do this not with stone, but with life itself, taking the chaotic, meaningless, and often painful raw material of existence and imposing upon it a new, beautiful, and life-affirming meaning. And what is the nature of these new values, these new meanings, that we must create? Nietzsche is clear, for they must be faithful to the earth. They must not be a slander against life, like the old, ascetic values that pointed to another, better world beyond this one. The new values must be a celebration of this life, in all its tragic and beautiful reality. They must be values that affirm the body, the instincts, the passions, the struggle, the joy, and even the suffering of our earthly existence. This is the great and awesome project that Nietzsche sets for the philosopher of the future, a task not to interpret the world, but to create its meaning, to legislate new values that will give humanity a new goal and a new direction for the next millennia. The biographical agony that underpins this entire vision is, of course, Nietzsche's own. For after his hammer had destroyed all the old idols of God, of truth, of morality, he was left in a state of almost total spiritual and intellectual isolation, a man standing alone in the void he himself had cleared. His later works, especially the prophetic poetry of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, are not just a description of this process of value creation, they are his own desperate, courageous, and often agonizing attempt to perform it, to create a new set of life-affirming values, a new gospel for a godless world. He had to live through the absolute terror of nihilism to find a path beyond it, a path he was charting in real time, completely and utterly alone. And so we arrive at the great, creative, and terrifying heart of Nietzsche's entire project. For he teaches us that the death of God is not a cause for despair, but the necessary condition for our own divinity. The discovery that life has no inherent meaning is not the end of the human story. It is the final, brutal, and glorious liberation that allows our true story to begin. We are condemned to be the artists of our own existence, the poets of our own lives, and the great, frightening, and magnificent burden of our freedom is that in a silent and meaningless universe, we and we alone are now responsible for creating the meaning of the world. 14. Eternal recurrence. Live as if you must relive your life infinitely. This great and terrifying freedom, this duty to become the creator of your own meaning in a godless world, raises a final and most difficult question. How do you know if you have succeeded? How can you test the value of the life you have created for yourself? Nietzsche, a man who loved the most extreme and most dangerous questions, conceived of a thought experiment so powerful, so profound, and so world-altering that he called it the greatest weight, the ultimate crucible for the human spirit, the thought of the eternal recurrence. He does not present this as a dry logical proposition. He presents it as a terrifying personal and existential confrontation. A story about a demon who comes to you in your loneliest loneliness to deliver a message that will either destroy you or deify you. He asks you to imagine this scene. What if, some day or night, a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it. But every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence, even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself." The demon is not offering you an afterlife, not a heaven or a hell. He is offering you this life, your actual, unedited, and unchangeable life, with every single glorious triumph and every single humiliating defeat, with every moment of ecstatic joy and every second of agonizing pain, with every act of courage and every cowardly compromise, with every word of love and every spiteful thought. All of it, exactly as it was, repeated not once, but an infinite number of times, forever. The demon then asks the ultimate question, the question that is the great dividing line for all of humanity. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? This is the test, and in your immediate, gut-level reaction to this question, your entire life is judged. The first reaction, the reaction of the herd, the reaction of the last man, the reaction of a soul still in the grip of resentment, would be one of absolute horror, for to be condemned to repeat a life filled with regret, with bitterness, with shame, with a secret and profound dissatisfaction, would be the most terrible of all possible curses. A hell from which there is no escape. This is the reaction of a spirit that has said no to its own existence, of a will that is at war with its own past. But then there is the second reaction. The reaction of the noble soul, of the spirit, that has achieved the state of amor fati. The reaction of the Ubermensch. This is the spirit that has lived with such intensity, such courage, such creativity, and such a profound love for its own fate, that the thought of repeating it all is not a curse, but the greatest possible blessing. To be able to look the demon in the eye and to deify him for bringing this news is to have lived a life so fully, so well, and so authentically that you would not have a single detail changed. It is the ultimate and final affirmation, the act of stamping the seal of eternity upon your own mortal existence. It is crucial to understand that the eternal recurrence is not primarily a cosmological theory about the literal nature of the universe. It is a practical, ethical principle, a psychological tool of almost unimaginable power. Nietzsche called it the greatest weight because it is a thought that, if you truly take it seriously, gives every single moment of your life an infinite and almost unbearable significance. It is a question you can ask yourself in every instant of your life, a new and terrible center of gravity for all your choices. Do I will this action, this thought, this feeling to be repeated for all eternity? This thought is the ultimate filter for action, a machine for forging a noble soul. If you knew you had to re-experience this hour of mindless, cowardly distraction for innumerable lifetimes, would you not immediately seek out a more meaningful task? If you knew you had to repeat this act of petty cruelty to another person forever, would it not choke the words in your throat? If you knew you had to endure the consequences of this act of cowardice for all of eternity, would you not be moved to find your courage? It forces you to become the artist of your own life, to live in such a way that you could will the eternal return of every single moment, not as a burden but as a joy. The biographical agony at the heart of this idea was Nietzsche's own profound and life-altering encounter with it. He wrote that the thought came to him in a flash of insight during a walk in the Swiss Alps, near a great pyramidal rock in Sils Maria, a moment of both profound horror and ecstatic revelation that became the turning point of his entire philosophy. His agony was the immense personal and intellectual challenge of living up to the standard of his own most terrible thought. He, a man whose life was a catalogue of almost constant physical suffering and profound loneliness, had to find a way to affirm his own tormented life to such a degree that he could joyfully will its eternal return. His entire later philosophy, his creation of amor fati and the Ubermensch, was his heroic and desperate attempt to build a worldview that would make it possible for a human being and for himself to pass this terrifying test. And so we are left with the most abysmal and most life-affirming of all of Nietzsche's ideas. For he gives us a thought that is the greatest weight, a burden that threatens to crush us with the infinite significance of every moment. And yet, it is only by taking on this greatest weight that our spirit can learn to dance. The eternal recurrence is not a promise of immortality. It is a challenge to live this single, mortal life with such courage, such love, and such creative fire that you would not trade it for any paradise, but would will it to be your only paradise, again and again forever. 15. The Ubermensch, Overman, the higher type who creates values beyond good and evil. This terrifying and exhilarating thought of the eternal recurrence is the great hammer that shatters the weak spirit, the ultimate test that separates the life-affirming soul from the life-denying one. But what kind of being, what new type of human, would be strong enough not only to withstand this most abysmal thought, but to embrace it with a divine and joyful laughter? This is the goal of Nietzsche's entire affirmative philosophy. This is his great and dangerous hope for the future of humanity. This is the Ubermensch. We must begin by performing a final, crucial act of intellectual demolition. For we must shatter the grotesque and fraudulent idol that has been made of this concept, a concept that was hijacked in the 20th century and twisted into a justification for the very thing Nietzsche most despised. The Ubermensch, or overman, is not a racial category. It is not the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Aryan master race of the Nazi caricature, for that racist, nationalist, and collectivist ideology is the absolute pinnacle of the herd morality, the slave morality that Nietzsche spent his entire life fighting against. The Ubermensch is a psychological and spiritual ideal, a goal for the sovereign individual, not for a biological or political herd. To understand the Ubermensch, we must return to Nietzsche's prophet, Zarathustra, who comes down from his mountain with this as his central teaching. For he looks at the people in the marketplace and declares, "I teach you the Ubermensch, for man is something that shall be overcome." He uses the powerful metaphor of man as a rope tied between beast and Ubermensch, a rope over an abyss, a dangerous crossing. Not a final destination, we have evolved from the animal, he argues, but we are not the endpoint of evolution, for we are a transitional stage, a bridge to something higher, something greater. The meaning of our existence, Zarathustra teaches, is not to be found in ourselves as we are, comfortable and mediocre, but in our capacity to become something more, for the Ubermensch is the meaning of the earth. The new goal that humanity must set for itself now that the otherworldly hopes of heaven have been exposed is a life-denying fiction. What then is this higher being, this overman? First and foremost, he is a creator of values, for he is the one who has fully understood and accepted the consequences of the death of God. He knows that the world has no inherent meaning, and that all the old moral tablets, the 10 Commandments, the foundations of good and evil, have been shattered. And into this terrifying vacuum of nihilism, where the last man pours his trivial comforts, the Ubermensch steps as a creator. He does not discover values, he invents them. He does not obey a pre-existing moral law handed down from a god or a society, he legislates a new one, born from his own powerful, life-affirming will. He is the artist of morality, the poet of his own existence, who takes the chaotic and meaningless raw material of life and imposes upon it his own creative form, thereby giving the earth its own new meaning. This act of creation is the highest possible expression of the will to power. Not the will to dominate others, but the will to create a new purpose for human existence itself. The second great characteristic of the Ubermensch is self-overcoming, for the German word Ubermensch can also be understood as the self-overcoming man. His primary struggle is not against an external enemy, but a constant, ruthless war against the all-too-human within himself, a war against his own desire for comfort, his own moments of weakness, his own pity, and his own herd instincts. He has mastered the chaos of his own passions, not by destroying them in the manner of the ascetic priest, but by sublimating them, by harnessing their immense power and placing them in the service of his great creative will. Third, the Ubermensch is a being of profound and total life affirmation, for he is the one who is strong enough to say yes to life in its entirety, without reservation. He does not need the comforting illusions of another world, of a heaven, of a divine justice that will make everything right in the end, for he is strong enough to affirm this life in all of its beauty, its horror, its joy, and its suffering, as a good in itself. This is the ideal of amor fati in its highest form. The Ubermensch is the being who can look at the entirety of existence and not just accept it, but love it, willing that nothing be different, and this is why he, and he alone, can pass the ultimate test of the eternal recurrence. For he is the one who can look back on his life and say yes to the thought of living it again, in every single detail, for all eternity. The biographical agony that haunts this concept is that Nietzsche knew, with a painful clarity, that he himself was not the Ubermensch. He saw himself as its prophet, its John the Baptist, the forerunner who must endure the agony of solitude and misunderstanding to prepare the way for this higher being. His own life was a constant and excruciating struggle for self-overcoming, a war against the decadent, Christian, all-too-human values that were bred into his own soul, and his philosophy was the record of his own heroic and often failed attempt to live up to the impossible standard he was creating for a future humanity. And so we are left with Nietzsche's most demanding and most hopeful vision. For after the death of God, after the coming of nihilism, he does not offer us a new God to worship, or a new system to obey. He offers us a terrifying and glorious task, to become gods ourselves, understanding that the Ubermensch is not a destination we will arrive at as a species, but a possibility that haunts each of us as an individual. For the meaning of the earth is not a truth to be discovered, but a value that has not yet been created, and the future of humanity rests not in the hands of the collective, but in the lonely, creative, and courageous will of the one who is yet to come. 16. Modern culture and comfort breed mediocrity, not greatness. This great and difficult goal, the Ubermensch, this creator of new values who is faithful to the earth, is not just a psychological possibility. It is a cultural one, a rare and beautiful flower that can only grow in a certain kind of soil. But Nietzsche, the great diagnostician, looked at the entire trajectory of modern European culture, and he saw that it was not cultivating the conditions for the emergence of this higher type. He saw that it was, in fact, systematically, deliberately, and with a kind of compassionate self-righteous horror, doing the exact opposite. For his most damning critique of his own time was that modern culture and comfort breed mediocrity, not greatness. The central and undeclared project of modernity, he argued, is a grand, compassionate, and, in his view, completely decadent war against all forms of human suffering. It is a 200-year-long crusade to eliminate all danger, all risk, all pain, and all hardship from the human experience. The tools of this war are the great achievements of our age: modern medicine, which seeks to conquer disease and prolong life at all costs; the modern democratic state, with its vast social safety nets designed to protect the individual from the consequences of failure; and the dominant philosophy of English utilitarianism, which defines the ultimate good as the greatest happiness for the greatest number. This entire project, on its surface, seems noble, humane, and self-evidently good. Who would not want a world with less suffering and more happiness? But Nietzsche, the physician of culture, saw this project not as a sign of health, but as a symptom of a profound and terrifying sickness. It was a sign of a civilization that had become exhausted, a culture that was weary of life, a humanity that no longer had the strength to desire a great and tragic existence, but instead longed only for a pitiable comfort. This relentless drive to eliminate suffering, he argued, is the ultimate expression of the triumphant herd morality. For what is its inevitable consequence? It is the domestication of the human animal. We have, he warned, taken the once wild, dangerous, creative, and unpredictable human being, and we are in the process of breeding a new and final type, a tame, predictable, safe, and utterly contemptible creature, the last man. He used the powerful metaphor of a zookeeper, for we have created a magnificent and comfortable enclosure for humanity, providing for all its material needs, protecting it from all predators, and ensuring its long and peaceful survival, but in doing so, we have stripped it of its freedom, its danger, its wildness, and its magnificence. He saw this process at work in all the great institutions of the modern world. He saw it in the rise of democracy and equality, which he viewed as a political system designed to ensure that the will of the majority, the herd, will always triumph over the judgment of the rare, exceptional individual. The principle of one person, one vote is, for him, a way of guaranteeing that the lowest common denominator will always set the standard, a systematic leveling down of all human excellence. He saw it in the rise of socialism, which he viewed as the ultimate expression of this herd morality, a system that seeks to eliminate all competition, all risk, and all individual striving in the name of a universal, and therefore universally leveling, security. It is the political program of the last man. And he saw it in the rise of a new culture of distraction, for the modern world, with its newspapers, its popular novels, its cheap entertainments, the 19th century equivalent of our own digital, 24-hour media landscape, was a machine for producing narcotics. It was designed to numb the pain of existence, to distract people from the great and difficult questions, and to keep them in a state of perpetual, mindless, and comfortable spiritual infancy. The biographical agony that fueled this furious critique was Nietzsche's own profound and painful sense of alienation from his own time. He was a solitary, suffering, and exceptional individual, living as an exile in an age that was declaring war on all exceptions. He, a man who lived a life of almost constant and excruciating pain, was a horrified witness to a civilization that was doing everything in its power to forget the very lessons that his own suffering had taught him. That greatness is born from struggle, that strength is forged in hardship, and that a life without pain is a life without meaning. His philosophy was a desperate, prophetic scream in a soundproofed room, a warning against the spiritual emptiness of a comfortable life, a warning that was, of course, completely and utterly ignored by the very people it was intended for. He felt like an ancient, noble soul, a throwback to a more tragic and more heroic age, who had been unfortunately born into a small-minded and self-satisfied world of shopkeepers and bureaucrats. And so we are left with Nietzsche's most uncomfortable and most anti-modern diagnosis, for he argues that our greatest and most celebrated modern virtues, our compassion, our desire for equality, our quest for a safe and comfortable world for all, are the very instruments of our own spiritual self-destruction. He teaches that the society that successfully eliminates all its monsters will also have eliminated the possibility of all its heroes, and the final terrible price of a world without suffering will be a world with absolutely nothing left worth suffering for. 17. Art Truth. Humans need myths and illusions more than cold facts. This devastating diagnosis of modern culture as a decadent, comfort-seeking flight from all hardship and greatness begs a crucial question: what is the antidote? If the scientific pursuit of objective truth leads to a cold and meaningless universe, and if the moral pursuit of universal happiness leads to the spiritual desert of the last man, where can humanity find a new source of strength, of meaning, and of the will to live? Nietzsche's answer is radical, profound, and a direct assault on the entire philosophical tradition that came before him. He finds the antidote not in a better religion, not in a more perfect science, and not in a more rational philosophy. He finds it in art. In one of his most famous and most revealing statements, Nietzsche declares, "We have art in order not to die of the truth." This single, explosive sentence contains the key to his entire late philosophy. To understand it, we must first understand the two terms of its equation. What is the truth that is so terrible it would kill us? And what is the nature of the art that serves as our great, life-saving shield against it? The truth for Nietzsche is the horrifying, primordial reality that is revealed to us in the Dionysian state. It is the direct, unmediated experience of the fundamental nature of existence. And what is that nature? It is a world of endless, chaotic, and meaningless flux. It is a world of constant creation and brutal destruction. It is a world saturated with suffering, a world in which the individual is a temporary, insignificant speck, doomed to be born, to struggle, and to be erased, without any cosmic purpose or justification. This is the terrible, primordial oneness of the will to power, the truth that the ancient Greeks glimpsed in their Dionysian mysteries. It is a truth so overwhelming, so terrifying, so completely at odds with our human need for meaning and order, that to look at it directly would be to fall into a state of nihilistic despair, a paralysis that would make life itself impossible. This is the truth of which we would die. So, how do we survive it? How did the Greeks, who he believed were the healthiest and strongest culture in history, manage to confront this terrible truth without being destroyed by it? They did so, he argues, through the miracle of art, specifically through the beautiful, life-giving illusion of the Apollonian. The Apollonian is the opposite of the Dionysian. It is the principle of form, of order, of dreams, of beautiful appearances. It is the force that takes the terrifying, formless chaos of the Dionysian reality and transforms it into a world of beautiful, distinct, and meaningful individuals. Apollonian art, the serene beauty of a Greek sculpture, the clear narrative of an epic poem, is a lie. It is an illusion. It presents us with a world that is more orderly, more beautiful, and more meaningful than the real world. But it is a necessary and a sacred lie. It is the beautiful veil that we must stretch over the abyss of existence in order to be able to live at all. It does not deny the terrible truth of the Dionysian, it makes that truth bearable. The highest form of culture, for Nietzsche, the great miracle of Greek tragedy, was the perfect synthesis of these two forces. It was an art form that had the courage to look directly into the Dionysian heart of darkness, but the strength to give that darkness a beautiful, Apollonian form. This leads to Nietzsche's great and radical claim about the relationship between art and truth. The entire philosophical tradition, from Plato onwards, had been built on the opposite assumption. Plato had famously condemned the artists, banishing them from his ideal republic, precisely because they were liars. They created mere copies of copies, illusions that were 3 times removed from the true world of the forms. For Plato, and for the 2,000-year-long tradition that followed him, truth was the highest value, and art was a dangerous and seductive distraction from it. Nietzsche inverts this entire hierarchy. He argues that the will to truth, the fanatical desire of the philosopher and the scientist to strip away all illusions and to see the cold hard objective facts of reality, is not a sign of strength. It is a symptom of a sick and decadent culture. It is a hostile, analytical, and ultimately life-denying impulse that wants to dissect and to kill the living, breathing, and beautiful mystery of the world. The scientist who can only see a beautiful sunset as a collection of light waves of a certain frequency, the philosopher who can only see a great love as a biological impulse. These are the modern barbarians, the men who in their relentless pursuit of a single, cold truth have made the world a poorer, uglier, and less meaningful place. Art, on the other hand, is the great stimulant to life. It is the highest and most noble expression of the will to power. The artist is not a passive mirror, reflecting the world as it is. The artist is a creator. They take the chaotic, and often painful raw material of their own experience, and they impose upon it their own will, their own vision of beauty, their own life-affirming interpretation. Art does not just reflect life, it enhances it, it completes it, it makes it more beautiful, more meaningful, and more desirable than it actually is. It is the great yes-saying force. The biographical agony that fueled this profound revaluation was Nietzsche's own journey. He began his career as a classical philologist, a scientist of texts, a man who had been trained at the highest level to be a servant of the will to truth. His entire discipline was based on the meticulous, objective, and dispassionate search for the one true meaning of an ancient text. His first book, The Birth of Tragedy, was his great rebellion against this training. It was a book that was savaged by his academic colleagues precisely because it was not a work of science, it was a work of art. His entire later career can be seen as a slow and often painful liberation from the tyranny of truth. He had to abandon the persona of the scholar to become the artist philosopher. He had to learn to embrace the power of myth, of metaphor, of the beautiful and necessary illusion, to convey the truths that the cold, rational language of academic philosophy could not touch. He had to learn that to be a true physician of culture, he could not just offer his age a bitter medicine of facts. He had to create a new and beautiful myth that would give it the strength to live. This is the great humbling and dangerous work of the soul. Nietzsche teaches us that you cannot become a good person by simply trying to be good. You can only become a good person by courageously confronting your own capacity for evil. The path to the light is not a flight from the darkness. It leads directly through its heart. To find the God within you, you must first be willing to shake hands with the devil. 18. Socrates and Plato corrupted Greek culture with rationalism and life denial. This profound understanding of art as the great life-saving force, this celebration of the beautiful illusion that allows us to endure the terrible truth of existence, was, for Nietzsche, the great secret of the early, tragic, and healthy culture of the ancient Greeks. But this strong, profound, and artistically magnificent culture did not last. For it was poisoned, he argued, from within by a new and seductive kind of thinker, a philosopher who declared war on tragedy, on instinct, on mystery, and ultimately on life itself. This was the beginning of the great European sickness, the decadent turn that would define the next 2 millennia of Western thought, and its first great symptom, its patient zero, was a single, ugly, and relentlessly rational man named Socrates. To understand Nietzsche is to understand that he saw Socrates not as the great hero and martyr of philosophy, as he has traditionally been portrayed, but as its great villain, its primary corrupter, the decisive turning point when the health instinct-driven culture of the tragic age began its long and catastrophic decline into a life-denying decadence. Nietzsche performed a ruthless psychological diagnosis of Socrates, and he saw not a noble seeker of truth, but a man from the lower dregs of Athenian society, a plebeian who was ugly, and who, out of a deep and secret resentment against the beautiful, noble, and instinct-driven aristocrats of his time, had to invent a new kind of weapon, a new form of power, and that weapon was the tyrannical force of reason. The entire Socratic project, Nietzsche argued, was based on a single, monstrous, and profoundly naive equation. Reason, y virtue, happiness. This is the belief that if you can just know the good, you will inevitably do the good, and if you do the good, you will inevitably be happy. It is the belief that all human problems are at their root problems of ignorance, and that the conscious, rational mind can, and should, have absolute dictatorial control over the much older, darker, and in Nietzsche's view, wiser world of the instincts and the passion. Nietzsche saw this fanatical rationalism not as a sign of strength, but as a symptom of a deep physiological and psychological sickness. For a healthy individual, a healthy culture is one where the instincts are sure and are trusted. To need reason to become a tyrant over your own instincts means that your instincts are already in a state of anarchy and chaos. Socratic morality, with its endless need for reasons and justifications, was the philosophy of a man whose own inner life was decaying, a desperate attempt to find a logical handrail in a world where his own vital instincts could no longer guide him. The famous Socratic method, the dialectic, was not for Nietzsche a noble and disinterested search for the truth. It was a clever and sadistic tool of plebeian revenge. Socrates, the ugly man who could not compete with the nobles on their own terms in terms of beauty, of strength, of instinctual grace, could, with his superior and relentless logic, humiliate and defeat them in public debate. He could trap them in contradictions, make them look foolish, and thereby assert his own different kind of will to power. The will to power of the clever man who uses reason as a weapon to dissect and to kill the living reality around him. But if Socrates was the symptom, the source of the infection, then his greatest student, Plato, was the genius who took these decadent, life-denying instincts and systematized them, who transformed the personal sickness of his master into a grand, seductive, and world-historical metaphysical system. Plato is the one who performed the ultimate act of slander against this life, the single most fateful and most poisonous invention in the history of Western thought, the creation of the true world. Plato, with his famous theory of the forms, split reality in two. He argued that this world, the world of our senses, the world of the body, of becoming, of change, of life and of death, this world is not the real world. It is a mere shadow, a copy, an illusion. And behind it, he claimed, lies a true world, a world of pure, eternal, unchanging, and perfect forms, a world that can only be accessed by the rational soul after it has escaped from the prison of the body. This, for Nietzsche, is the original sin of philosophy. It is the invention of a fictional beyond that has only one purpose: to devalue, to condemn, and to slander the only reality we will ever have. It teaches humanity to despise the senses, to feel guilty about the passions, and to see this earthly existence as a kind of unfortunate mistake, a temporary trial to be endured before our soul can return to its true, otherworldly home. The biographical agony that fueled Nietzsche's war against these two figures was his own profound and lifelong love for the culture that they had destroyed. As a classical philologist, he had spent his life immersed in the world of the pre-Socratic tragic Greeks. He revered the dark, paradoxical wisdom of a Heraclitus. He felt the magnificent, life-affirming power of their great tragedies. His agony was that of a man who was in love with a dead world, a world that had been, in his view, murdered by the optimistic rationalism of Socrates and Plato. His entire philosophical project was a kind of intellectual patricide, a desperate and painful attempt to perform a vivisection on the very fathers of his own discipline, to prove that the supposed founders of Western reason were in fact the originators of its deepest and most enduring sickness. And this leads to his final and most devastating connection. This Platonic invention of a true world beyond this one provided the perfect, ready-made philosophical architecture for the religion that would come to conquer the West. Plato's world of the forms became, with a few minor adjustments, the Christian heaven. The philosopher's rejection of the body became the saint's ascetic ideal. Plato's good became the Christian God. The entire project of Christianity, Nietzsche famously and devastatingly declared, is nothing more than Platonism for the people. It is the popularization, for the masses, of the same decadent, life-denying and otherworldly instinct that was first given its brilliant and seductive philosophical form by Socrates and Plato. And so Nietzsche reveals the great original crime at the heart of Western thought. For he argues that the two men we celebrate as the fathers of philosophy, the great champions of reason and of truth, were in fact its great corruptors. Socrates and Plato did not liberate the human mind. They imprisoned it in a cage of concepts, and in their fanatical war against the beautiful, tragic, and instinctual wisdom of the early Greeks, they taught humanity the single most poisonous and most enduring of all lessons: how to despise life in the name of a beautiful and comforting lie about another, better world. Nietzsche himself is dynamite. His mission was to destroy illusions and force humanity to confront the abyss. And so we arrive at the end of our long and difficult journey through the mind of this most dangerous of all philosophers, and we are left with the final and perhaps most accurate image of the man and his mission. An image that he himself provided in the final, ecstatic and half-mad pages of his autobiography, Ecce Homo. For in that book, as he surveyed the totality of his own life's work, he made his most famous and most terrifying self-assessment. "I am not a man," he declared, "I am dynamite." This was not a metaphor for simple political violence. It was a precise psychological and spiritual description of his entire philosophical project. For Nietzsche did not come to reform, to persuade, or to build upon the foundations of the past. He came to detonate them, to place an explosive charge at the very heart of the 2,000-year-old edifice of Western civilization, and to light the fuse. His mission, first and foremost, was one of total and uncompromising destruction. A great cleansing fire that would burn away the decadent, the sick, and the life-denying illusions that had, in his view, poisoned the human soul. He was the philosopher with a hammer, and his great joy was to strike the hollow idols of his time and to listen for the sound of their shattering. He took his hammer to the great idol of Christian morality, and he struck it until it was revealed to be not a divine commandment, but a sophisticated system of spiritual revenge. A slave morality born from the vengeful hatred of the weak, a system that had taught humanity to be ashamed of its own strength and to worship its own sickness. He took his hammer to the great idol of philosophical truth, and he struck it until the beautiful marble facade of objectivity cracked, revealing that there are no facts, only interpretations, and that every great philosophical system was just a disguised personal confession, a sophisticated mask for the raw underlying will to power. And most terrifyingly, he took his hammer to the greatest idol of all, the very foundation of the entire Western world, the belief in God, and he struck it until it crumbled into dust, announcing to a world that was not yet ready to hear it, that we had killed him, that we had untethered our earth from its sun, and were now drifting into an infinite, cold, and meaningless night. This great destructive mission was not an end in itself. It had a profound and terrible purpose, for Nietzsche believed that only by destroying all of our old comforting illusions could he force humanity to confront the abyss, to stand naked and alone in a world without God, without purpose, and without any preordained meaning. This confrontation with nihilism, with the terrifying truth of a meaningless existence, was for him the necessary and unavoidable crisis of the modern age. The biographical agony that defined his life was that he had to be the first to make this terrible passage, for he was a man who felt the full, crushing weight of the death of God in his own soul, a man who had to live through the horror of this cosmic abandonment while the world around him continued in its blind, thoughtless slumber. His solitude was the solitude of the prophet who has seen the coming catastrophe and whose duty it is to announce it, even if no one will listen. He had to be the dynamite, even if the explosion would tear his own mind apart. But he was not a nihilist. He was the first great anti-nihilist. For he believed that it was only after we had confronted the abyss, only after we had endured the terror of absolute meaninglessness, that a new and higher form of humanity could finally become possible. The destruction was a necessary clearing of the ground, a violent plowing of the field, so that something new and more beautiful could grow. His entire affirmative philosophy, the will to power, amor fati, the eternal recurrence, and the great aspirational goal of the Ubermensch is his answer to this crisis. It is a philosophy for a new kind of human being, one who is strong enough to live without the crutches of the old faiths, a being who does not discover meaning but creates it, a being who is not a creature but a creator. And so we are left with the ultimate paradox of Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who called himself dynamite. His great destructive act of blowing up the foundations of the Western world was not an act of nihilistic despair, but an act of the most profound and most terrible hope. He believed that only by destroying the comfortable prison of our old certainties could he force humanity to confront the terrifying open field of its own freedom. And only by confronting the abyss of a meaningless universe could we finally take upon ourselves the sacred, the difficult, and the almost impossible task of creating a new meaning for the earth.